your questions. In addition, Lauren will help ensure that we are all upholding the community agreement, which can be found in our conference support hub. If at any time you are in violation of our community agreement, you may be asked to leave. During our session, we recognize that the topics being presented may contain potentially triggering or activating content for members of our audience and community. We are committed to honoring the journey of each individual takes to healing. So we invite you to engage with this content in a way that is safe and true to your healing. We believe that this topic, imagining life beyond the binary, is important to our conference. We want to create a space where folks can share stories while doing so in a considerate and sensitive way. Please feel free to take a break, step away, and/or turn off your camera at any point during today's presentation to take care of yourself during these conversations. Now, I have the great honor of introducing the presenters for today's session. We are joined here by Reynolds and Stephen Feldman. Stephen Feldman, they works as the Associate Director at the Center for Trans and Queer Advocacy at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. They hold a BA in Music and Gender and Sexuality Studies from Muhlenberg College, an MA in Music History and Theory from Stony Brook University, and an MA in Higher Education and Student Affairs from the University of Connecticut. Prior to coming to WCU, Stephen had worked in undergraduate admissions, academic advising, and LGBTQIA+ services. They have presented research locally and nationally on social justice topics and have been published in the Educational Review, the ACUI Bulletin, and the NASPA blog. They also have articles forthcoming in the Eastman Case Studies and Journal of Student Affairs. Outside of their work in higher education, Stephen enjoys iced coffees from Dunkin', sure does, performing and listening to music, and binge watching shows on Netflix. Reynolds, she, her, is an undergraduate student at Westchester University and is pursuing a BA in Media and Culture with a double minor in Creative Writing and Sexuality Studies. She works as a peer educator at the Center for Trans and Queer Advocacy at Westchester, as well as with the Resource Pantry as an ambassador. She presented last year at the Ruby Jones Conference on LGBTQIA+ representation. Outside of school, Em loves to read books, 40 last year, writing, watching movies, especially Disney, Marvel, Star Wars, binge watching Netflix and YouTube, and drinking tea. At this time, I'd like to turn our session over to our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Hi, everyone. How are we all doing? Thumbs up, reactions. Love it. Amazing. It is so wonderful to see you all. Yes, please feel free to have your cameras off if you would prefer that. I'll let you know that there will be a moment later on in the presentation that we'll do some breakout rooms and do a little activity together. So I just want to give you the heads up that that's coming down the road in maybe like 20, 30 minutes-ish. But yeah, Em and I are super, super excited to be with y'all today. I'll start off by sharing a little bit about sort of what today is going to look like. So where we were thinking we would go with this is let me maybe first start off by sharing where the idea for this presentation came from. Em and I have been having some conversations about thinking about our advocacy and our activism around gender equity and liberation. And we were thinking about it in sort of different ways. So Em has been studying this in a lot of their classes, and I obviously have been working as a full-time professional, and so we've been approaching this sort of from different ways. But we realized that we don't actually give ourselves the space to pause and think about and imagine, well, what does a world without the gender binary look like, right? We know that we want to eradicate the gender binary. Good, great, we're all on board with that. But we're constantly doing work. We're constantly saying, let's protest, let's boycott, let's donate money and post on social media and do all of these incredible things, which are absolutely necessary. And we're doing all of this to try to get to a goal, right? But we don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what does that goal actually look like? Because we've never lived in a world without the gender binary. So we don't know what it looks like. So today we're gonna really allow all of ourselves to center imagination. So I hope y'all are as excited as we are. We're going to structure this kind of like my music theory classes in undergrad. So I don't know if any of you are music majors, but when I was an undergrad, I had to take 3 music theory classes. So in the first 2 courses, they teach you about the structures of music. So they teach you how to construct harmonies and melodies and rhythms. And they say, you know, if you want this chord to go to that chord, you have to do it in this particular way. And then in music theory 3, they say, remember all those rules that we just told you? Throw them all out the window. None of them matter. You can actually do whatever the hell you want with sound. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. Is we're going to start off by talking about what are the conventions that we've been taught about gender, the gender binary, gender roles. What's the language and the terminology that we need to understand so that we can then have a conversation about how do we tear it all apart and what does it look like once we've torn it all apart. Does that make sense? So I'm gonna get us started with some quick terminology. Some of this may be review for folks. I know if any of you were in the session earlier with Shelby Lewis, they did a phenomenal job talking about some of this with gender identity and expression. So like I said, some of this may be review, but I think it's important for us to ground ourselves in this conversation. So to start off, talking about the gender binary, there are 2 important phrases that we need to know. One of them is gender identity, and the other is gender expression. So gender identity is one's internal sense of self. It's one's own internal understanding and self as it relates to gender. So the way that we decide our gender identities is that as we're growing up, we hear this messaging in society, right? Society tells us this is what a boy is supposed to do. This is what a girl is supposed to do. This is what a man is supposed to be. This is what a woman is supposed to be. Hopefully we also hear some other words thrown in there. This is what non-binary can look like. But you know, oftentimes when we're kids, we don't hear that. Sometimes when we get into college, maybe we get to be exposed to that. But regardless, we hear all of this messaging, right? And so even from a young age, we start to understand, okay, if this is what society says as a man, okay, that kind of resonates with me, or maybe that doesn't resonate with me. And so we take that information, then we decide for ourselves, okay, this is what, I'll use myself an example. I know society has told me this is what boys and men are supposed to do. And I'm like, all right, this fits for the most part. I don't know that it perfectly fits, but I don't know that I have a better word yet to describe me. So I'm going to use that. It kind of resonates. No one gets to decide your gender identity other than you. And you get to choose that for yourself. Now, gender expression is, as it sounds, it's how we express gender to the world around us. So we do this in a number of different ways, right? We do this with our clothing. We do this with colors and makeup, and even just you can think about the way that we walk, the way that we speak, right? There are very gendered ways. When I was in middle school and high school, I was bullied a lot for how I moved about amongst like the classroom spaces or in my PE classes. And so I consciously made the decision to change how I sounded, to change how I walked, to try to appear a certain way. All of those are different examples of gender expression. Importantly, your gender expression does not necessarily need to match your gender identity. A great example of this is drag performance, right? Drag queens historically are cisgender men who are expressing femininity. Drag kings are historically cisgender women who are expressing masculinity. Now, it's important to know that, you know, they're doing it for a performance, right? But you don't need to be doing it for a performance in order to express your gender or express gender, whether it's yours or not, however you would like. So the reason I'm sharing those 2 terms to get us started is because it really shapes our understanding of gender roles, right? So society, as I said, gives us these messages about who is supposed to be doing what, right? We could play a game where I could list off professions and you would say whether it's for men or for women, right? If I were to say doctors, you'd say historically for men. If I say nurses, you'd say for women. If I say professors, you say men, teachers for women, right? We have these understandings of what gender roles are supposed to be and how we're supposed to behave. And it's also important to recognize and sort of situate this within a historical context. So gender itself as a word, as a term, is actually kind of new. In the grand scheme of history, it's actually a little bit new. It emerged in the 20th century, sort of mid 20th century or so. And actually, our definition of gender has also changed. So I say this because I see that there's a bunch of students on the call. You are probably familiar with the term of gender that I just described to you. That's actually not the definition that originally came out. When gender as a word first emerged, it was used as a way to talk about how we go about creating these sort of socially imposed divisions based on sex. So at the time, it was based on male, female. And gender was how we impose regulations and restrictions around sex. Now, of course, since then, thanks to feminism, thanks to gender theory, we've branched that out and we've said, all right, well, it's actually more than just sex. Gender might be its own separate thing. And we could complicate that too if we want, but that's probably for another presentation. But because of the course of that, we've sort of separated gender out and we're talking about the gender binary and complicating the gender binary. And all of that is because of this larger conversation that we've been having as a society around gender versus sex, and what it means to be man, male, female, woman. And then thankfully, as language has emerged, we've been able to capture more kinds of experiences. So non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, right? We have all this new terminology that we can use to talk about these different experiences. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Em to continue our conversation about some of that history and talk a little bit more about what this means for the gender binary.
All right, thanks so much. So as Stephen was kind of talking about with this relatively new history, if we think about especially with gender reveal parties, you see a lot of pink and blue. That's all really new as well. We have these kind of hard and fast rules that we think of that are actually really recent. So if we look back to the late 19th century, all children wore pink skirt, or not pink, not pink at all, white skirts and dresses up until the ages of about 6 or 7. And this was really very practical because white things can be bleached and it was a lot easier to keep those clothes clean because kids are really messy. And so that resulted in all children wearing very gender neutral, albeit very frilly and lacy clothing all the time, which is a very stark contrast to today, where people will put a pink bow headband on their little girl's head in order to so that people can identify that she is a little girl at first glance. And that how we got from there to here has changed a lot over the years. In the early 20th century, there's an article from June of 1918 specifically, actually, where pink was accepted as being the color for boys because it was a very strong and very decided color. It was a diminutive of red, which was a very masculine color. Whereas blue was considered to be for little girls because it was a very delicate and dainty color. So just the complete reversal of what we would consider today in general culture. And then, so moving forward through the 20th century, you get into the 60s and 70s with the women's liberation movement, where girls were dressed more gender neutrally, but in a more masculine kind of way than they were years earlier, where everything was what we would consider more feminine. Now they were dressing girls to be more masculine because they thought that removing them from the kind of frilly, girly clothing would kind of distance them from the kind of subservient roles that women tend to take on, which is obviously not what we would consider today, but was kind of the thinking back then. And that trend kept going until the mid 1980s, where prenatal testing became much more popular. So you could find out the gender of or the sex of your baby before they were born, and so therefore you could buy all of your baby items to match the gender of your child. And so now if you found out you were having a girl, you could buy all things that were pink. So everything from diapers and clothing, crib sheets and car sheets, strollers to toys could be very directed. And so moving forward, child development experts say that children do not become conscious of their gender until around the ages of 3 to 4, and don't realize that gender is a permanent fixture until about the ages of 6 to 7. And so basically, as consumerism became more popular, especially for children, children became the targets of these advertising campaigns that reinforced social conventions of gender, basically giving kids the idea that, being female means that you have long hair and wear dresses, and that children would buy things based off of that, or their interests would be based off of that, which really complicates things for parents of gender non-conforming children, or just children who don't strictly conform to those genders. And like, how do they do you dress to conform to that binary, or do you express yourself through your clothing? So we've talked quite a bit about the gender binary. I think that we've gone over kind of what that means. I have a couple of notes on that if I need to clarify, but I think that we have it pretty well covered. It's essentially just the classification of gender into two distinct and opposite forms, in this case, male and female, or masculine and feminine. And so breaking out of that, looking into non-binary genders, some of which Stephen listed earlier, we can actually look at a country that has been making a move towards this. There's like some concrete evidence of how this is working out, specifically in Sweden. So back in 2012, they started using the pronoun hen, which is a gender neutral pronoun, in preschools. So teachers will use it for their students, kids will use it amongst themselves, just as an alternative to gendered pronouns. And this has actually spread out past just pronouns and past just Sweden. So other European countries have started adopting these kinds of ideas. And also, like, in the article, they talked about how the aisles for toys for kids are no longer labeled boys and girls, and so they're still color coordinated as being blue and pink, but they don't have these like explicit labels on them anymore. They have children's books that are coming out that feature gender neutral protagonists instead of male or female protagonists, and they use words like children instead of saying boys and girls, for example, and they encourage what is called norm critique, which is a Swedish school of thought which teaches that traditional norms, such as distinguishing between woman and man, or gay and straight, or even disabled and able-bodied, need to be dismantled in order to achieve true equity or equality in society. So that's a little bit of the history and the present of where we're at with the binary and the non-binary.
Yeah. So now what we're going to do is break us up into some breakout rooms to do a little bit of an activity. So we're going to do is have some small group discussions, and you amongst groups. I think I'm going to do we're small groups, so maybe 2 groups. And in your small breakout rooms, talk amongst yourselves to try to answer, and I'm going to put it in the chat, to try to answer this question, which is, what does a world liberated from the gender binary look like? Okay, I'm not going to say it's going to be an easy task, but in your small groups, we're going to spend maybe 5 to 7 minutes in small groups talking about trying to answer this question, and then we'll come back as a larger group and talk about how that activity sort of went with you all. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. And let's see if this works. I haven't done breakout rooms in a long time. Okay, I think we are all back. So hi everyone, good to see you all again. So now we're going to have a short conversation as a large group. Again, feel free to have your cameras on or off, whatever you would prefer. But just curious to hear from folks, like how was that activity for you? Like, how did it go?
I thought it went very well.
I think for me, it was really interesting to talk about how I would like physically see it. Like I talked about you seeing it more in like stores and the way that clothes are set up and the language that we're using. But then we also started talking about how we also don't want to erase, right, the man and female identity either, because some people take a lot of pride in being a man or a woman or a trans man or a trans woman, right? We don't want to take that away from people either when we're looking at, you know, gender and gender identity. So that was a really good part of our conversation.
Yeah, remind me about that. I'm going to come back to that. I have some thoughts on it, but yeah, how did it go for other folks? Was it easy? Did you find it hard at all?
We found it pretty hard. One of the things that kept coming up was just the idea of freedom, you know, this idea of being able to be totally free to express yourself without judgment, because that's something that we see all the time, kind of everywhere, is this judgment, you know, for whether or not it's expressing your feelings or expressing yourself through your clothing and things like that. So that kind of kept coming up in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think what was hard for me was, where does it start, right? I'm like, okay, does it start do we start with babies, and right, and that generation is going to be the one to see it through, or because it's so imbued into every part of our culture and our life that it's hard to think about what's that tipping point going to be.
Yeah, where do you start, and also where does it end? Like for me, that's where I always get stuck, because I'm like, all right, I can change some policies, right? But that's not going to get us there in and of itself. Or okay, I'm gonna do this presentation today, but that's great, but that's not going to be enough. Like when will we? Like, I'm sure we'll know when we get there, and I'm sure I won't live to see it. But like when I hope I do, but you know, when we as a society get there, how will we even know that we've done it? Because like I struggle because I don't know what it looks like.
For me, I have something that I think it looks like for myself, and I would know that I'm there when, I said this to my group too, when I'm not coded as or assumed to be a woman. And another thing for me when it comes to imagining a future free of gender binary is the elimination of normal and accepted identities, and then everyone else, the other non-normative identities. When it's just normal and okay to be anything on the gender spectrum. Right now, we only really have cisgender men and women that are there, and everyone else is a non-normative identity or a non-normative body and is treated as such and punished for it. So when that's gone, I think we'll be there too.
Yes, for sure. What about other folks? What did you all, how did you all answer the question? Or did you all come up with something? Maybe you didn't.
My group also discussed bathrooms a bit and how there is a need for gender neutral bathrooms. And I related it back to the university I attend. We have like think 1 or 2 gender neutral bathrooms, and mostly all the dorms have male or female in the classrooms also. And that's like an everyday struggle for people who are non-binary that cisgender people don't realize that that's an everyday thing.
Yeah. Last year was my first year working at Westchester, and I was trying to get a sense of the community, and so I was talking to a group of students, and I had asked them, you know, if what would Westchester look like for you if it were perfect for trans and queer people? And what was interesting was a lot of folks said more gender inclusive restrooms. One person said we would stop gendering restrooms in the first place. And I was like, for me, that's the difference, right? It's not just that we need more gender inclusive restrooms or gender inclusive restrooms in all buildings, but like, why do we gender them in the first place? Let people go pee. Like, and so I think that that's super, super important, and definitely a clear instance of where something gets gendered. Yeah, so I hope you all enjoyed that activity. Like I said, for me, I struggle with it, but it's, I think, so important because we don't spend enough time sitting in that space of trying to imagine what it looks like, right? And so I think it's important when we're thinking about advocacy, when we're thinking about social justice, to really think about what are we fighting for? Where are we trying to go? Where are we trying to get? And does this meet what we want it to be doing? Right. And think about like 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement and the response to the killing of George Floyd and many others. There were different approaches, right? There were protests on the street. There were people calling for donations, and then there was a response with this black square. I don't know if any of you remember, but there was this thing on Instagram where people were posting black squares, and it started with I think with good intent. Unfortunately, it got co-opted, and ultimately, by the end of the day, I mean, over the course of less than 24 hours, it went from this thing that people really were excited about, and then very quickly changed. And people were like, "Why are we doing this? This does actually defeats our purpose." When we hashtag a black square with Black Lives Matter, now when people click on the hashtag, they're not being brought to resources; they're just seeing a whole wall of black squares. And so I think that for me was a moment of like, you're right, we need to constantly be thinking about, is our work getting us to that end goal of gender equity, and not just equity, but liberation of the gender binary. And so to get back to Lauren, what you were talking about earlier of like, we're not trying to get rid of man and woman. I think it's interesting because when Em and I were talking about this, we were having a conversation of, is the end goal that all identities matter, right? That we value non-binary identities and trans identities just as much as cisgender men and women, so that everyone matters? Or is the end goal to the point that no identities, like we don't need labels anymore, right? Because everyone will be equal. The reason these labels exist in the first place was to subjugate people. The reason why we have the word transgender was because cisgender people needed a word to other trans folks. So it's interesting because as Em and I had a bunch of conversations, and I know Susie and I have talked about this as well, of like, you know, us in the Center for Trans and Queer Advocacy, we do trainings. We're talking about the importance of respecting people's identities, and all of that is absolutely important. And in this future world where the gender binary doesn't exist, is it that everyone's identity matters and all labels matter, but we don't subjugate people based on it? Or is it that we just don't need the labels anymore because there is no subjugation? And depending on which path you think, it might affect what advocacy and activism you want to do. You know, for example, if I'm going to do a training, do I need to focus? You know, at the start of this training, this presentation, we started with, what is gender identity? What is gender expression, right? I framed it around music theory. You have to learn the rules in order to break the rules. Well, if the end goal is no rules, Why do we teach the rules in the first place? So it's interesting, and I'm not saying I know the answer, because I don't. None of us have lived in a gender equitable world. But I think it is, if nothing else, important for us to sit in the space and think about what do I want? I myself, but also like for each of you, what do you want that gender equitable or gender liberatory world to look like? And what steps can you take to get there? So, Em, I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts for us before we open it up for questions.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And that was something that a lot of what we ended up going with the presentation was built on, was how our trainings tend to center and focus on these identity-based things, and how moving forward, what does that look like? And also, I think that going back to something that Stavi said, I think this is something that I maybe skipped over a little bit earlier, was in terms of like being coded as a specific gender, despite that might not be how you identify. So how, like, right now gender is very coded in sex and biology, and this assumption that biology is kind of also binary, and that's also not true. And so it goes past even like the social issues into a lot of other issues that could be their own presentation. But yeah, kind of that idea of like, this isn't binary in the first place. There's so much in between the binary. So like going forward, how do we center that and allow, I think also something that Stavi said, where everything is considered normal. I think that, like, normal is such a weird word, but also like there isn't normative and non-normative. Everything is just all considered under the same umbrella. And yeah, again, because identities are really important to people, and how they identify and respecting that all is really important. So in going forward, how do we contend with both of those ideas?
Yeah. So ending with some thoughts. Our goal was never to give you answers in this session, because there are none. We're still working on it together. So I guess with that, does anyone have any questions or other thoughts that you'd like to share before we wrap up? Hearing none, I will turn it over to Susie to do the concluding part of the session, and then I'll look forward to seeing some of y'all at the next session with Chloe.
Thank you once again to our brilliant presenters for joining us today, and to our participants, thank you for your time, energy, and commitment to gender justice. Please consider filling out our evaluation, which will be sent to you via email. Please visit the QR code that Lauren's posted there to record your attendance for today's session for any reason. We hope you join us for our next session, a conversation with New York Times bestselling author Chloe Gong, as well as our keynote with Eric Hart at 6 p.m. To learn more about those sessions, please visit our conference support hub. Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you.